Well, good morning, FCCT. How are you guys doing today? Good. All right. So, still a lot of people I hear about being sick. So keep praying for all those among us that can't be here and that are still under the weather. It's been a rough year for that. So I don't know what's happening. I thought since COVID was over, we were in the clear, but apparently that's not going to happen. We're going to be in 1 John chapter 3 today. If you'd like to turn there. We're going to, continue on with this sermon series about community called The Table. And today we're talking about future versus present. And the reason for that is because of what immediately happens. Like, I don't know if you've ever experienced this, but you're doing your Bible reading, you're doing your prayer, you hear a message, you read a devotional, something happens, it inspires you, and you say, I'm going to be more loving toward people. And inevitably what happens when that happens is that the first person that you'll encounter after that will be a very unpleasant person. Have you guys noticed that? Anybody ever noticed that? That's exactly what's going to happen as soon as you say, I'm going to participate, I'm going to be a part of God's community, or I'm going to try to be more loving to those in the community. The first thing that's going to happen is that there's going to be a test of that. And we represented that up here today with, we have this chair. It's nothing special, but it's a decent chair for a dining room table. This one represents something that's maybe not quite as decent. I got the dirtiest chair I could find to kind of represent, the person that's just hard to deal with. That's who this is. We have not named this chair. It doesn't represent anybody in particular, okay? Don't worry. But just, that applies to somebody you know. If it doesn't apply to somebody you know, maybe that somebody is you. But we'll talk about, how is it that we deal with that? Because even people that are easy or fun to deal with all have their moments, right? And this is one of the major difficulties of dealing with community or living in community is how do we deal with sin? How do we deal with a lack of perfection? How do we deal with all of our sharp edges, all of our rough spots that grate on other people? And how do we deal with that in a way that honors God? And, as we get into this, I was thinking about somebody that I remember watching, and I thought it was when I was a kid, but I started looking at dates, and I would have been older. I wouldn't have been a kid, but there was a guy named Ricky Carmichael, and there was a race that he was in. He was a guy who competed in motocross racing and supercross racing, and he had dominated the 125 class as he was coming up. He was one of those kind of guys that even at a young age was very good at what he did. And as he comes up, he's in the 125 class, which is a smaller bike, smaller engine. And he just completely dominates that class. And then he decides that he's going to move up to the top class, the 250 class. And so he's going to do that. And people are saying, no, this is never going to work because this guy's small. He's not big enough to handle these bigger bikes. It's just not going to work. And so the very first season, he goes out and it's a disaster. Doesn't win a single race for the first time in his career. Win an entire season without winning one race. And then the second season comes around. And as the second season comes around, everybody's wondering what's going to happen. Is he going to finally have gotten over this? And the answer was no. He won one race the whole season. Again, a complete disaster. Now, the thing is that in motorcycle racing like this, the people who sponsor the teams, they spend a lot of money to do this, and they're not going to just have people who are losing on their teams forever. And so what happens is that to the 2001 season starts, and there's a race in San Diego, a supercross race in San Diego. That's Sammy Hagar living in San Diego, apparently. San Diego. And Carmichael was going to face the top supercross racer of all time at that time, His last name was McGrath. And so this big matchup of Carmichael versus McGrath was on. And in that race, what happened was these two were clearly the fastest people out on the track. And within just a matter of a few laps, they were so far away from the rest of the field that it was basically a race between just two people. And what happened was, in going around this corner, McGrath made a slight mistake. It was ever so slight, but they had been racing side by side for so long that this one small mistake was all that Carmichael needed to get past. But everybody knew from the last two seasons that Carmichael could not handle a big bike, that his style of racing, which was very low finesse and very high, just gun it, was not working with these bigger motorcycles. He couldn't control them, and they knew that it was a matter of time before Carmichael would wipe out, and probably in a very spectacular fashion, as he had done many times through the last two seasons. And yet, as the race went on, Carmichael got further and further and further ahead. And the question was, how is this happening? And at the end of the race, he had a huge lead. He won this amazing victory. The very next week, McGrath won again, and they thought, well, that was it. That was his one race. And that was the last race that McGrath would ever win. Carmichael won the next 5 races. Season ended, and from there on out, he was dominant. He became the greatest of all time. How is that possible? Well, what's interesting is we're going to talk about some things that have directly to do with us in our community, and how do we deal with one another based on his amazing transformation. And we're going to talk about these 3 things. We're going to talk about, number 1, is the future real? Is the future real? You know, we talk about the future a lot. We plan for the future. We dream about the future. Is the future real? Secondly, we're going to talk about snakes in the garden. And finally, we're going to look at having some real encouragement. What does it mean to encourage one another? So let's talk about, is the future real? You know, one of the things that was very fascinating is people didn't know that in that 3rd season, Ricky Carmichael had made some decisions. And he made some decisions about what he needed to do to win. And he was serious about winning. And the reason that he was serious about winning is he did not come from a racing family. And his family had made huge sacrifices in order for him to be where he was in professional racing. They had sold almost everything that they had. They had lived in a trailer on a construction site just so they could have the money to get him into racing. His dad had sold his kind of pride and joy, his Harley Davidson motorcycle. And Ricky Carmichael had said that as soon as I turn pro, I'm going to buy that motorcycle back for you. Because it was not lost on him how much his family had put into this. And not only just in the aspect of money, but because they didn't come from a racing family and they couldn't afford a coach, his mom had become his coach and designed his training program. And they had a friend who was a personal trainer. And when Carmichael had realized that he was not strong enough to handle these 250 bikes, he realized he was going to have to be stronger. Well, the only guy he knew that could train him, and never trained a motorcycle rider before, and yet he was able to use that guy's help to train. And what happened in all of this is something that's very important for us to understand. And it's something that we deal with all the time, although we don't realize that we do this. You see, all of us sacrifice and suffer in the service of the future. All of us do that, don't we? We sacrifice and we suffer in the service of a future. And the question is, well, is that future real? Because if that future isn't real, then you're a fool. You know, imagine meeting somebody and them saying, like the Carmichaels, if Ricky Carmichael had never become the greatest racer of all time, and you would go to his parents and you would say, why did you make such foolish decisions, wouldn't you? Why did you sacrifice everything, including your own futures? Why did you give up your house? Why did you give up your jobs? Why did you give up all the possessions that you had? Why did you give up these things that you valued and cared about? Why did you do that? That was foolish. You're a fool. And you probably wouldn't have to say that to them, because they would probably be saying it to themselves, wouldn't they? You see, here's the thing that we have to understand. if you become a champion, all of those sacrifices are worth it. And he did become a champion, and he did buy his father's motorcycle back, and he did buy a ranch, and he did, his family, their future was amazingly different than it would have been if they had never made the sacrifices they did. So what does the Bible say about the future? Well, Philippians chapter 1, verse 6 says, "And I am sure of this, that he who began a good work in you will bring it to completion at the day of Jesus Christ." There's a certainty involved in the future for a Christian. There's a certainty for it. And what that means is that any kind of sacrifices that you make now are not foolish, but wise investments. If you make a sacrifice that will make sense if you see heaven, then it is not foolish. It's not foolish. In fact, this came up with the Elliots. I don't know if you remember, there's Elizabeth Elliot is a woman who's had a very prolific writing career and speaking career. She's gone around the world telling her story of her husband Jim, who went off to be a missionary amongst a group of tribal people in the Amazon jungle who had never had contact with Western people except to kill them. And so what he had done is he flew his plane around in circles and lowered a bucket, and because he was going in such a tight circle, the bucket would be stationary, and he lowered down gifts to them to help them to understand that he was a friend. And eventually him and three other guys, went and landed on a sandbar near their area and waited for them to come. And they were going to introduce themselves to these Indians, and they had brought gifts and things like that. And what happened is that the Indians did know that they had landed on the river, and they went there, and they killed them all. And most people would say, well, that was foolish. That was foolish. And what happened was Elizabeth Elliot was not done. In fact, she made contact with the tribe and eventually went back to the tribe. And she was able to, with the work of others, they were able to bring this tribe to the knowledge of Christ. And the man that killed her husband eventually baptized her son. And Jim Elliot had said something, and he said, "He is no fool who gives up what he cannot keep to gain what he cannot lose." He was basically saying, look, if this is true, if what the Bible says is true, and if my salvation is found in Jesus Christ, and that has been accomplished on the cross, then I am not foolish for making any kind of sacrifice in service to this future. Because really this is what the essence of faith is. If we turn to Hebrews chapter 11, it's known as the faith chapter, and I encourage you to read the whole chapter today at some point, because it's such a fantastic piece of Scripture. But in verse 7 it says, "By faith Noah, being warned by God concerning events as yet unseen, in reverent fear constructed an ark for the saving of his household. By this he condemned the world and became an heir of righteousness that comes by faith." What is this talking about? It's talking about how Noah got word from God about what the future was going to be, and he made a huge sacrifice. He built this gigantic ark. And what a foolish thing that would have been if no flood had ever come. Right? But here's the point. Faith is more than... See, we have this tendency to believe that faith is the belief that God exists right now. And that certainly is an aspect of faith, but most of faith is actually forward-looking. It's a confidence about the future. It's a confidence about God's character in the future and how that character is going to be displayed for you, towards you. Can you believe the promises of the Bible? In Hebrews chapter 11, verse 13, it says, it's talking about all these people in the Old Testament, and it goes through this kind of list of all these people of great faith and kind of how that faith was seen. And it says, "These all died in faith, not having received the things promised, but having seen them and greeted them from afar, and having acknowledged that they were strangers and exiles on earth." This is talking about this fact that all these people who are commended for their faith in this faith chapter, Hebrews 11, none of them received what was promised. Like their whole life, they didn't receive it. What was the promise? The promise was that Christ would come and He would make a way for sin to be resolved and for us to be reunited in a relationship with the Father. That was the promise, and all these people acted on that promise and made sacrifices on that promise as if it was certain, as if it were true, as if it had already happened. They lived as if the thing promised had already happened, and none of them ever received it their entire life. Were they fools? In Hebrews chapter 11, verse 1, it tells us what faith really is. It says, now faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. Now, what are things hoped for? Do you hope for things that you already have? How many of you guys do that? You hope for things that you already have. No, nobody does that. You hope for things that you don't have yet. It's in the future. That's what hope is about. It's about some future thing. You don't have it yet. But faith is the assurance of that. Surety. Confidence. Unshakable confidence. The conviction of things not seen. Something that you already have, something that has already taken place, is something that is seen. Something that is unseen is in the future. The sacrifice and the suffering that we go through always precedes having its value in our hands. You see, if we go back to the story of Ricky Carmichael, you could say to his parents, well, why are you doing that? You don't know if he's ever going to amount to a hill of beans. Have you guys heard that? Have you guys ever been accused that you won't amount to anything, a hill of beans? I don't know what that means exactly, but it doesn't sound good. So here's the thing. If you would have gone and said that, the thing is that the idea is that, well, don't make the sacrifice until the thing is worth it, right? But how does that work exactly? Do you see what I'm saying? Like, you can't do that. They saw potential in their son, and they couldn't say, well, if he becomes a great motorcycle racer, well, then we'll make the sacrifices necessary. That's not the way that it works. You have to make the sacrifices before it's worth making the sacrifice. That's why you have to have this faith. You have to have this assurance of things not seen. It's not foolish if it works. It's terribly foolish if it doesn't work. You have to make the decision before you know whether it's foolish or not. A farmer in a field. Back through most of human history, that's how people lived, as they grew their own food. And usually it was a pretty close-run thing, whether or not they would have enough. And a farmer is making a bet. He has his seed, and he could eat that seed. He could feed his family with that seed, or he can save it, and he can go out and throw it on the ground and waste it, right? And if that crop comes up, and especially if it's a good crop, then he's not foolish. But if crop doesn't come up, if all of it dies, then he was a fool for doing it. And you don't know, you have to have faith. The question is do you believe that this is true in your life? Do you believe that this is true in your life? When you look at yourself, do you look at yourself and do you judge yourself and do you evaluate what sacrifices you're willing to make on behalf of yourself? Do you do that based on who you are now or who you will be? Because a lot of people, what they do is they go through life and they only make the sacrifices for themselves based on who they are now. And that's why they never get to where they would hope to get. You see, the problem with most people, and most people are most people, the problem is that what we do is we say to ourselves, well, you know, if it works out, then I'll do it, but if it doesn't, then I don't want to do it. We look at ourselves the way we are now, and we look at the way that the value that we place on ourselves now, and we say, well, I don't know if I'm worth making that sacrifice. I don't know if it's worth making that sacrifice. Whether it doesn't really matter what it is, right? It could be, going out and getting more education so you could have a better career, or it could be, losing weight so you can be more healthy, or any number of things, right? It doesn't really matter what it is. But a lot of people, the value that they give themselves is the value that they see that they currently have. And a lot of times they don't feel like they're worth making the sacrifice for. But if they had a certainty about what they would be in the future, they might be more than happy to make that sacrifice. The question is that, do you believe that this is true about yourself? The Apostle Paul said that he was the chief of sinners, chief among sinners. He didn't look at himself and say, man, I'm so great right now. The reason that I run, the reason that I persevere, the reason that I suffer, the reason that I go through all these hardships is because of the glory that I have right now. I'm worth it. No, that's not what he said. He said, I run for the prize. It's worth it in the end. And you have to have faith that that's the case. Now, what's really fascinating about this idea is that it brings meaning to the present moment and to your present choices. The only reason to choose the finding a blessing through sacrifice now is the reality of the future. And the fact that you can change the reality of the future by the sacrifices that you make now. You see, a lot of times we don't realize this. See, a lot of times what happens, and if you guys have ever been on a diet, I've been on a diet, I know how this works, right? You have the choice between eating what feels good now or eating in a way that makes the future real. And what's really fascinating is that if you can never get to your goal, it doesn't make any sense to make that sacrifice. If you will always be where you're at now, health-wise, it doesn't make any sense to make that sacrifice. But if the future is real, if there's glory ahead that is real, it makes every sense to make that sacrifice now. And it brings down this meaning of that sacrifice. You're literally choosing between who you are now and who you could be in the future. And that's what's happening in that choice. And that makes that choice so worthwhile and so valuable. Why am I saying all this? We were talking about community, and all I've done is talk about ourselves. Isn't that the way it works? It's so hard to think about others. We just focus. No, that's not it. The reason that I'm talking about this is because this is the foundation of our community with one another. This is the foundation of our community with one another. The thing is that you might say to yourself, you might look at the person that's at the table with you, and you might say, I don't know, that person's hard to deal with, man. They are difficult. And I'm not diminishing the difficulty of some people you might have in your life. You might say they are difficult. And the question is that are you going to treat them as the difficult person they are now, or are you going to treat them as the person that they can be in Christ Jesus in the future? Because that makes all the difference. That makes all the difference. Here's the thing, man. Have you ever had a friendship that didn't start off very well? A relationship that didn't start off very well? I mean, it's in all the romantic comedies, you know what I'm talking about? They're always like hating on each other, and then all of a sudden something happens, like there's a moonlight, there's fireworks, something happens. They fall and hit their head. Something happens. And then all of a sudden, they're in love with each other, right? And maybe that's the way it happened for you, but by the number of times I've seen this in movies, It must be the way we all get together, right? But the thing is that maybe you've had somebody in your life that turned out to be a good friend, and they didn't start off that way. The question is that if you knew that that friendship was going to end up the way it was, would you have started it differently? Here's the point. The point is that God's salvation, the salvation found in Jesus Christ, the future that we have in Him, do you have faith that that's true for you? And then, by extension, do you have faith that that's true for other people? Is it only true for you? Is Christ's salvation only found for you? Is sharing in Christ's glory only your future, nobody else? Or is there a whole community of people? Is there a whole group of people? Is there a whole kingdom of people who share that same future? And can you treat them the way that they will be now, not the way that they are? Can you treat yourself that way? Secondly, we need to talk about snakes in the garden, because the thing is that it's easy to talk about this in kind of a theoretical way, but I think it's important to understand that this is actually all around you, and it's very practical, and it's something that happens every day. John Bender was a guy who was completely a genius. I mean, there's no really other way to put it. He was a genius. And he was a guy who was involved he was a mathematician, a guy who was incredibly gifted in mathematics, and he ended up getting a job as a trader on a stock market. And he was able to figure out ways of looking at the market and looking at the trends and trading that made him, in his early 30s, he had made over $500 million trading stocks. Now, not all of that was his money. Some of it was other people's money, obviously, but he had become fantastically wealthy. And he was just a brilliant guy, and he married a woman who was a very attractive woman, and they had a great relationship. They seemed to very much love each other and enjoy each other, and people saw them as like the perfect couple. And what he decided was that there was no reason why he had to keep living where he was living, because he was very, very wealthy. At this point, he didn't need to do that. And so he thought about, well, where do we really want to go live? And they decided that what they really wanted to do was to buy some land in Costa Rica and to open a kind of like a wildlife refuge, a game preserve there. And so they bought 5,000 acres. It was mountainous, but it was on the coast. 5,000 acres that would just be theirs, and they could go on hikes, and they could look at the wildlife, and they could put up, no trespassing, no hunting signs, and they could try to keep people out. And it would be like the Garden of Eden. But they needed a house to live in, and so they put up a modest structure. It was about 50,000 square feet. That's what you do when you have a lot of money. And they built it right on top of a mountain. 50,000 square feet. We have an upstairs here at the church. It's more than double the size of our church building. That's how big their house was. And the interesting thing about it had no walls or windows. It was a round structure, and it had multiple floors, and it was just screened in because the climate there was so nice, being on the coast and being up kind of elevated on top of this mountain. They didn't need air conditioning or heating, and so it was open to the sounds of nature all the time. And they had all kinds of wildlife all around them. It seemed to be perfect, except one time they went into town and some people tried to kidnap them for ransom. And so they realized that there was some danger in the area that they were in. And so they hired armed guards. And so now things were great, because basically now it is Eden, because it's not only a garden, it's a walled garden. There's a wall of armed guards all around them. And so everybody was shocked when John Bender turned up dead, shot in the head in his bed in this beautiful place. And immediately the question was, well, who did this? Who could possibly have done this to them? And nothing seemed to be taken. There didn't seem to be any robbery. What was going on? Well, very quickly in the police investigation, it came down to one of two people. Either John Bender had killed himself, or his wife had killed him. And as they started to investigate, what they found was that even though this looked like it was completely a case of living in the Garden of Eden, things were not very good there. Because John Bender had been incredibly depressed. All he could see in himself were his flaws and his faults. And he had become more and more depressed over the years. And in the last couple months, he had become suicidal, writing all kinds of things in his journal about the desire to kill himself and the desire to end it and how he couldn't stand to be with himself any longer. Ann Bender had also become very depressed and was later diagnosed as what do you call where they go both ways? Bipolar, thank you. That could have been taken the wrong way. Bipolar. Bipolar, yes. Sometimes your brain does not engage. Bipolar. And so what happens is that she was down to 80 pounds or so when they found her, and she had to be in the hospital for months to recover from the way that she felt about herself. So the question is that what happened? And there was 4 different trials. 4 different trials. And some trials she was found guilty, and some she was found innocent. And the last trial she was found innocent, so she got out of Costa Rica, and then she found out that they wanted to put her on trial again. And they're not sure to this day what happened. Some experts say obviously he shot himself. Some experts say obviously he didn't shoot himself, she shot him. But here's the thing. Either way, we know what ultimately happened is either he lost faith in his future or she did. Either he lost faith in his future. I will never be better than I am. I will never get over these problems. I will never tackle these issues. I will never get to the point of more glory than I have now. I will never get there. Either he got to that point and said, this will never happen. I've given up. Or she said, he will never get better. You see, the problem, what they didn't understand is that they made this walled garden and it seemed to be perfect. And not only did they have all this, but they had $20 million worth of jewelry in their house displayed in these amazing cases. Like you went into their house, it was just something completely else. It was this amazing return to the Garden of Eden. And yet the snake was already in the garden. The snake was already in the garden. Because it was in here. And that snake was doubt. That snake was, we will never get past whatever is ailing us. There's never going to be in a future. And it didn't matter really in the end whether it was him or whether it was her. The outcome was the same either way. You see, what's fascinating is that the question of whether or not we have been forgiven, whether or not we have been made God's child, is so important to us. And the way that we look at ourselves then becomes the way that we interact with other people. Do you believe that you have been forgiven? 1 John chapter 3, 1 through 3. See what kind of love the Father has given to us, that we should be called children of God. And so we are. The reason why the world does not know us is that it did not know Him. Beloved, we are God's children now, and what we will be has not yet appeared. But we know, notice that word, we know that when He appears, we shall be like Him, because we shall see Him as He is, and everyone who thus hopes in Him purifies himself as He is pure. Notice what kind of love the Father has given, that we should be called children of God. And so we are. So we are. Not so we will be, so we hope to be, so we one day might be, so we are. And what we will be has not yet appeared. It's not, we don't know exactly what it's going to mean in the future for us to be fully revealed as the children of God. We don't know that. But we know, this is something we know. This is not something that we necessarily hope for or not something that we wish for. This is something that we know. We know that when He appears, we shall be like Him because we shall see Him as He is. And everyone who thus hopes in Him purifies himself as He is pure. The snake in the garden is the doubt of the glory of God being shared with us in Jesus Christ and the future that gives to us. Why is that the snake in the garden? In Matthew chapter 22, verse 36 through 40, it says this, "Teacher, which is the great commandment in the law?" Or your translation might have, "Which is the greatest commandment in your law?" And He said to him, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the great and first commandment, and a second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments," notice this last sentence, it's so important. "On these two commandments depend all the law and the prophets." So, love for God. Why should you love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, strength? Why should you do that? Because He has made it possible for you to become His child. Because in Jesus Christ, He has put everything out there for you. He has made the ultimate sacrifice. Jesus Christ gave up His life for us. There's no greater thing, there's no greater sacrifice, there's no greater act of love that could have been done to secure our future in Him. There's nothing else. There's nothing greater. The ultimate has been made, and so the ultimate love has been required of us. It's just for us to love Him with all of our hearts. Why? Because of what He has done for us. So you see what happens is that our love for God and the strength and the depth of that love is dependent on our faith in what He has done for us. You cannot love God that much if you don't believe that He has secured for you a future at the greatest cost possible. And what's interesting is that then that becomes the foundation. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. How are you loved? You're loved by God to the point that He would send His Son to die for you. That informs how you are loved. How do you love somebody else? In the same way. You see, what happens is that this knowledge of God and what He has done for us not only informs how we view ourselves and how we look at our future and how we evaluate every choice and action that we're making, but then that becomes the foundation for how we treat this other person, no matter how they look now. And if we don't believe that, and if that's not the foundation for our community, then there is a snake in the garden that will eventually devour everything that exists that is good. Well, let's talk about real encouragement, because I think that's really important for us to understand. How do we help other people? What does this interaction look like? How do we help other people? How do we be good neighbors? How do we live in community properly? Well, we encourage each other. And this goes down to this idea of feeding at the table. What do we do when we eat at the table? We come together. What happens is we treat each other prophetically. Why is the table a place for nourishment? Why is the table a place for life? Because when we come together, we treat each other not the way that we are, but the way that we will be. And that becomes life and food for us. Because you know what? It's going to be easier for you to treat yourself the way that you will be if somebody else is treating you the way that you will be. If somebody has grace for you in the midst of your sins, in the midst of your traumas, in the midst of all the things that are going on in your life, if somebody has grace for you, then you end up dealing with yourself graciously, and you end up understanding that God is dealing with you graciously. In 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, verse 11, it says, Therefore, encourage one another and build one another up just as you are doing. Encourage each other and build one another up just as you are doing. So why are we encouraging each other and building each other up? Why are we doing that? Why? I mean, that takes a lot. It's difficult to treat people the way that they will be, not the way that they are. It's difficult to encourage them. It's difficult to do that. Why are we doing that? Now, one of the things that's so fascinating is that when you do that, not only does it change them and their future, but it changes you and your future too. You know, one of the things that's really interesting is that Ricky Carmichael became the greatest of all time racing, motocross racing. The greatest of all time. Why? Because his parents saw what he could be and treated him as if that were the case. But you know what's interesting is his mom has had this amazing career training motocross racers. Why? Because she designed a program for her son that helped to transform him. Other racers came and said, "Can you do the same for me?" Transforming her son transformed her life. The guy who was just a personal trainer that came along, didn't know anything about motorcycles, he's now the most in-demand personal trainer for motocross riders. Why? Because transforming the way that he looked at this guy, seeing what he could be and not what he was, developing a program and encouraging him, giving him the courage to get to where he could be, transformed his life. You see, here's the thing that's so important. We talk about believe, belong, become. We talk about it all the time. And as we're talking about it today, it's so important to understand this, that when you encourage somebody, it's important to look at the word and understand it. Encourage means to give courage. It means to give courage. And one of the things that we fail to do, when we look at the way things are now, and oftentimes what we do is we do the opposite of encouraging people. We don't say, you know what, this is who you're going to be, act like that. We don't say that to people. We say, oh, well, this is who you are. You shouldn't be expected to be any more than you are. That is not encouragement. It is not encouragement to do that for people. What's encouragement is to say, you know what, this is where you're at right now, but that's not the way we're going to deal with it. We're going to deal with this the way that you're going to be. You can become better. You can become who God intends you to be. And I want you to treat me that way too. I want you to give me the courage to make the sacrifices that are necessary now in order for my life to become what God intends it to be. And I will do the same for you.
Thanks for joining our worship service today. Please follow us on our Facebook page where you can let us know about any needs or prayer requests you may have and keep up with the latest church news and events. You can also check out all of our past lessons and other videos by visiting our YouTube channel. At First Christian, we strive to be the presence of Christ in the world by helping others to believe in God's love for them, to belong to this church, and to become like Christ in their lives. If you would like to support us in our ministry, you may do so by giving online through our website at www.fcct.org or by mailing checks to the church. Have a great week.